Hello, hi everyone, and welcome back to the Talkonomics podcast. Today we have an episode with a guest with whom most probably we'll be covering loads of community-related things. It's all going to be about communities, about blockchain communities in specifics. So without further ado, just let's dive in and talk to my guests. So as a reminder, this is the Talkonomics podcast brought to you by Amazix, which is a global blockchain and marketing firm, blockchain consultancy and marketing firm. And we are live streaming podcast episodes approximately once a week from the Amazix LinkedIn page and from my personal profile. So make sure you go and follow the Amazix LinkedIn page to be notified when we go live. So without further ado, let's dive in and welcome our guests for today. Hello, Paul Gordon. Welcome.
Hi, Annie. Thank you for having me on the show.
Now, I actually wanted to meet you since a long time because just for those who don't know, Paul Gordon is leading one of the most vibrant blockchain communities, blockchain and crypto communities in London, CoinScrum. So I've heard about it back in, I think it was 2016 when I was just getting introduced to blockchain. And so usually the way I do this is I just go on social media and ask, anyone from the network, who could I talk to in order to learn more about the space, right? And everyone who came back to me giving some recommendations, they told me, oh, you're in London. What you should do, the best shortcut is just you have to go to a CoinScrum meetup, and you'll have everything covered. So, and the interesting thing
all the pizza you need.
The interesting thing is that the people who were recommending me that were people who lived in the US. So your coverage is quite broad, and not only London-based people know about the meetup. So yeah.
Good to hear. I think, I think we had someone from Rio de Janeiro that had, when I introduced myself, said, "Oh, CoinScrum." So I'm like, "Oh my god, we've kind of gone far and wide." But no, that's good. That's great to hear. It's been a privilege to be part of this crazy ecosystem and part of the community, and it's about the community at the end of the day. So I just put the events on and bring people together, hopefully.
Well, I'm absolutely sure that we're going to cover the crazy bit for sure, because that's something that I would love to do. But before that, I know that CoinScrum is not your full-time job. So can you tell what you're doing?
Well, I'm spending more time on it now. It did very much start out as a hobby, and it really kind of happened more than anything. Before you knew it, it's 7 or 8 years has passed by, 7 years, I think. And we're still going strong, and I'm still kind of motivated to put on events every month and bring people together and hear about the interesting projects. My background was, people have come into this space from all different angles. Obviously, it was very kind of high density of developers in the very early days. My background was in trading, in derivatives trading and financial markets for over 20 years. And so I think those, in the early days, it was either really traders or developers, and it's that's still a core focus, but it's attracted people from all walks of life, which has been amazing. So I moved into around 2014. Actually, took off my trading hat. Not completely. Recognized quite early on that there were going to be problems in terms of how the trading and exchange ecosystem in this space was potentially going to look when the professionals came to the market. So I did start working on a startup quite early on, which was looking at that, trying to bring some traditional market infrastructure into this world. We started quite early. It was the right idea, probably a bit too soon. So for various reasons, I put that aside last year. For the last 6 or 9 months, been looking at the community that has developed over this time to work out what we can do with it. So we've actually launched some different event streams. We're looking at, primarily being quite core technology focused over the years. We've recently launched events which are looking at the trading ecosystem and, hopefully creating some more accessible content, which isn't too technical. We also, just this week, we relaunched our startup and investor pitching events as well. We've always had a healthy number of startups and founders meet at our events and then form companies and businesses. So we're looking to promote that again. And now the dust has settled after the whole kind of ICO frenzy. I believe we're starting to see some interesting new teams form and projects start to come out of the woodwork, and expectations are tempered and far more sensible, which is a good thing, I think. So we had 6 really good teams pitch on Tuesday morning this week, and we'll be doing that again. So that's taking up a lot of my time. I'm an investor in various projects as well. So I advise or sit on their board, looking at strategy. And even though I was working on one startup, I've kind of got the bug. So I'm in the early processes or phases of scratching down some new ideas for the next project.
Okay, got it. So you've got your hands full. That's
I've got my hands full.
So.
But always brainstorm.
So I mean, I'm sure that being a person from marketing, I know that one of the hardest things to do is to build a genuine community around you, especially when you're starting from scratch. Let's start from the story of how CoinScram came. How did you come up with the idea? Was it something that just happened and organically developed into something bigger? Or did you know this was going to happen? Like, what was the origin story of CoinScram?
Okay, well, that's a good place to start right at the beginning. I do always make this very clear because although I've run CoinScrum, which started out as the first Bitcoin meetup group in London, I won't take the credit for that. It was another, I'll come on to it, but it was another chap actually started that group. So this was way back in 2012. I first came across Bitcoin in around 2011. Started looking into it. As I said, I didn't come from a technical background myself. So probably took quite a while for me to get my head around it, and a good few months of finding, being on the forums and reading whatever I could find and asking questions before it really clicked. And I, like everyone else has had at some point, had that light bulb moment. I thought, okay, this is going to be very interesting. I was actually, everything was on forums then. We had Bitcoin Talk. I think there was maybe 2,000 or 3,000 members there. There was a Reddit had launched maybe in early 2012, the Reddit page for Bitcoin, and I think there was about 500 people on there when I joined that, which was quite nice because I remember, everyone got excited if there was one post a day, but you could reach out to the core developers. Other people were coming on there. I remember people like Fred Wilson from Union Square Ventures, who's had some very successful startups in his time, was an early investor in Coinbase. He popped up on there from time to time and asked the community what was going on, what they thought. So, it was a lot more manageable and less noisy then. But then I think around that time, everyone thought, well, it can't all be online. I want to go and meet other people that like this, because it felt very strange. I think anyone around that time will know that if you kind of got the bug for it, and then when you started talking to your friends about it, they were like, yeah, you're crazy. Go away. So everyone wanted to find some other people that to prove that they weren't completely mad. So I was looking around on Meetup, and I was too nervous I thought, well, I could post my own Meetup, but it's going to be like super hardcore geeks, and I'm going to be out of my depth. So I didn't do it. And then I kept looking, and then a chap called Ian Cresswell actually posted an event, said, hey guys, like Bitcoin, fancy meeting up for a beer in a pub in London. And so I dived in. I think there was about 20 people joined the group, and then
good things always start from beer.
Yeah, they do, and in a pub, definitely. And so I turned up. It was in late September in 2012. Myself and 4 other people. Ian, of course. There was Christian Bott. There was Johnny Bitcoin, who's a bit of a legend within our community, and Dennis Lukanov. And we sat there and kind of just geeked out about Bitcoin. So it was 5 of us. The next month we met again. There was still 5 of us, and I think the next month again there was still about 5. There was still 5 of us as well. And then after that, 1 or 2 more people started turning up. By early 2013, maybe we had 10, 15 people in there, and it gradually grew from there. Normally, as has happened over time, it kind of the price drags in the people. Early 2013 was when we started seeing one of the early, was probably the second Bitcoin bubble, start to build. And so we grew and grew. We had some really interesting people there. We had, people probably know the company Elliptic. Those guys, the three of them were always at the events. But then on the other side, it was still very underground and still very kind of, I guess, you had the very the whole libertarian mindset was really very prevalent as well. So we had developers, very well-known developers such as Amir Taki coming in, and who's doing some seriously good work for the Bitcoin project in general. People like Richard Brown, who was at IBM and then went and became chief architect of the R3 Corda platform. And so thinking back and having all these really broad mix of people, it's fascinating to see how things have moved on. And then I think what happened in we're around April 2013 to May, we went from maybe 20 people in the pub to 80 the next month, something like that. And there's not really room for us in the pub. And then after that is when I thought, well, we need to get this more organized. So that summer, I think it was July, I put on the first seminar style event. So we got some people in to speak, some guys that were working on some early projects, some guys were talking about technology. And that was the kind of first of this, seminar networking type, presentation format, and carried it on ever since.
Okay, sounds good. So, it started quite niche, as you said, when the thing started developing, and also the price of Bitcoin was kind of essential in that sense. More people started coming. So in the beginning, it was like a core developers community. When you had the new waves coming in, how did it change the whole kind of vibe and the whole kind of diversify? Did it diversify? Was it good? Was it worse? How did you feel about the changes that came in with this new type of people coming in?
Well, I think what we've always done, and when I started running the events, and when we started having, there was more at the beginning, there was really only Bitcoin to talk about. So we didn't have all these other variety of projects. We did. There was Johnny Bitcoin, who I mentioned earlier. Actually, I remember Vitalik Buterin's flatmate used to come to the events as well, and he was friendly with Johnny. And Vitalik Mihai had asked Johnny if he knew any developers. He introduced Gavin Wood, who became the co-founder of Ethereum, to Vitalik, and seeing all of that evolve. So it was always very, we always obviously there was the developers, but I think it was from the beginning, from those early events, very early on, you saw people in the legal profession coming because they saw they had an interest and an opportunity. There was always a very wide mix of creative people in there as well. From the very beginning, there's always been this notion that and we're seeing that still today, is that art and Bitcoin for some reason are some kind of marriage, which, I've always been struck by that, things around provenance. So it really did attract people from all walks of life. And because, I think I just go back to one of your earlier questions, like getting a community going. To be honest, it's slightly fortuitous. A few things. We're based in London. So there's a lot of people covering all kind of sectors of industry and business. So that's fortunate. Back then, there weren't any other events. So like yourself, if you were going around or you had to say, right, I want to learn about this, where can I meet people? You would come to Meetup and you would find us.
Yeah.
It was only 2014, like the Ethereum guys, they started their Meetup and they used to come to our Meetup. So, it was slightly fortuitous that we're in the location we are, and back then there weren't many options. But what that meant is that, and because our community did start from those original those formative days, is we've always had a very knowledgeable community. And I think what everyone likes about our events is if you're a complete newcomer, you can come in, and like me, when I said, I was scared about going to the first event, I thought, I'm going to be out of my depth. And I think that's what people like when they come. They can always find someone who will never be dismissive, who will, be patient, answer their questions. And when we put content on, we could go really deep and, start talking about deep cryptography and, topics or, conversations which really are meant for, people with a specific skill set. I've always asked people to present somewhere in the middle, to challenge newcomers, but to engage those that do have kind of better understanding as well. And I think we've always pitched that right. And I've quite often had people come up to me afterwards who have been newcomers, and this is what I like, and this is what I like to do, is say, I really didn't get what they were saying, but I'm going to go off and learn about it. And I think that's the sweet spot. And I think, it's easy to be spoon-fed something, and I think it's good to be challenged enough to be, we only learn if we go and do our own research.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you mentioned, especially in the very beginning, there weren't too many people who thought and were interested in this subject. So, many, as you mentioned, thought you guys were crazy, and it was very hard for you to explain this stuff to your friends and family. So yeah, like-minded people, getting among them is very important. But what was that thing in Bitcoin that made you believe in the thing and made you see that it is something worth being curious about and learning more about? What was that thing that made you understand that no, this is not madness, this is really something serious, this is something worth sticking to?
Well, there's a couple of things, I think. I first heard about Bitcoin, I was sitting at home. For those of you not in the UK, Channel 4 News is kind of one of the more kind of reputable news programs on every evening, with an anchor called Jon Snow, who's a bit of an institution in the UK. And they did a piece on the Silk Road, because the Silk Road had started about 6 months before. The Silk Road is actually what first gave Bitcoin any form of value. It only just started trading again about 6 or 7 months before on Mt. Gox. And it had a use case. It was a dark market, but had a use case. And there was a huge bubble when Bitcoin exploded from 10 cents up to $30 and then crashed back down to $5 or $2. It all sounds very familiar. But that was kind of the first bubble. And they ran a piece on the Silk Road. I previously, although I said I worked in financial markets, I did have a kind of brief kind of career break and ended up working in project management during the dot-com boom for some web design agencies. So around that time, there'd been, it's when PayPal was getting going. I'd heard about e-gold, which had been, one of the earlier iterations of DigiCash, which had been the earlier attempts at, using some kind of cryptography for online currency. And that had always been a dream of the pioneers of the internet, that money would be baked in. So it was interesting, and these things hadn't worked though. So on this piece that Jon Snow was running, they were talking about Silk Road, obviously trading illicit goods, but they said, they trade and transact using an anonymous digital currency called Bitcoin. And literally the word jumped out of the telly me. And one Google search later, there I am. I'm looking at a chart. And for me, originally, it's like, well, that looks like an interesting price chart as a trader. I've got to look into this. So I sent a little bit of money to Mt. Gox and started playing around with it. But it was, and I left it there and didn't really think about it. And then looked back, and a few months later with my friend who had bought some, and it had halved in price. And so I think we actually we coined the term shitcoin then, because we were calling Bitcoin shitcoin then, because it had halved in value. But after that, I thought that I've got to look into this. Started moving. I think it was only then I actually moved the Bitcoins from the exchange to my first blockchain wallet. And it was when I did that, was like, hold on a minute, what's happened there? Just moved this value around, and seeing it. And I think that's always an essential thing when people are skeptical. Is like, look, just try it and realize what's going on in the background. I've moved this thing around, and no one else can touch it, and there's no one in the background. And after that, that's when I really started reading, getting into it. And I think to answer your question, when I finally understood the mechanics and worked out how the whole mining process worked and everything. That was it. And this is the one thing that was unique, is irrespective of the money, the idea of it being digital cash or store of value. It was the idea of digital uniqueness, that you could have something that was digital and provably unique without the need of a central party. And I think that from the beginning, that I could just instantly see so many opportunities around that. That was such a unique idea, and that's when I thought, there's no way that this isn't going to turn into something. And like everyone else, we were sitting there, it was strange. We're in a pub with 5 of us, and we could see this opportunity, and we're like, where's everyone else? I mean, why can't people see this?
Yeah.
But eventually other people will come to the same conclusion, obviously. So it just takes time. But the problem is, for people to trust it and understand it, you really do have to kind of go and take a deep dive to understand it. Back then, especially, I think the problem is now too many people are happy to leverage other people's opinions and trust things. We saw that during the ICO frenzy. Anyone would suddenly be an expert and say, oh, you must buy this, you must buy that. I think people that have been around a bit longer were like, no, why? I mean, that makes no sense. But, that was just an interesting exercise in groupthink, I think, and seeing how these things go viral, especially when you've got a money-making opportunity baked into it. It was incredible to watch from the sidelines, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the ICOs and kind of, the thought process behind it, and having people kind of rely on other people's opinions. So also you mentioned before that in the beginning, everyone was sharing this libertarian viewpoint and kind of around Bitcoin. Do you think that with the ICO move and with this new big wave of people coming in just for pure speculations without really diving into the tech and the philosophy behind the whole concept, do you think that kind of changed overall perception of the field? Did it kind of harm it in a way, or what was the impact?
Well, I think there's always been a case, especially as people have been starting businesses. I was working on my own. It can be frustrating. There's I remember again other things that came out of the networking group back in as early as 2013 when people were starting to form companies, and as everyone knows, it hasn't changed very much. But getting bank accounts was a problem. You couldn't start a business. People were spending 6 months just trying to do what other companies do in a day and open a bank account. We were knocking on the FCA's door. We were having meetings with them. Some of the members of our group went and we were speaking to HMRC very successfully. They managed to convince HMRC to change their original tax guidance. So there were some successes, but again, it was such a small industry. The motivation or incentive for any of these large organizations to really do anything wasn't there. But I think, and as it's grown, as I said, I think that the critical difference between this is, when we've seen technology booms in the past, there's been opportunities to invest in companies, but that's normally been, not as simple and easy as the ICO thing was. So I think, there was very much part of it was the FOMO or of missing out on a new opportunity. But at the same time, I mentioned the original Bitcoin bubble in 2011. We had one in 2013. We had one in 2017. The commonality through all of those waves was that, those bubbles grab a lot of media attention. That's what they do. They're a big beacon going off. Whatever happens, some people will have lost some money. Some people would have hodled and felt like they were losing money but made money. In the grand scheme of things, it's hopefully a lesson to people in terms of not getting too sucked into these things. But each of those waves, it's dragged in talent. It's broadened mind share. And during the subsequent downturns, how long they've lasted, people have gone off and built things. And however, it might only be iteratively and not as speedy or happening speedily as people would like, but we've moved on every time. And if you compare that 2011 bubble where the media attention was in, probably it was in Wired magazine or TechCrunch, there was a few small articles, it made it onto Channel 4 News, but that was it. By 2013's bubble, it was on Bloomberg, Reuters, every financial outlet.
Yeah.
And now it's, by the end of the last bubble, it's listed on stock tickers on Bloomberg and in newspapers every day, and is treated as a potentially serious asset class. So, we have made progress. You always get these kind of overhyped parts of the cycle. But in the end, things flatten out. And I think overall, if you look back over time, we've made good progress. And, I mentioned the event we did the other day. We did allow a few ICO pitches during that time, but I kind of stopped them quite quickly because the quality wasn't there. I think we're now seeing people come in, recognizing where the problems are, very importantly, people coming in maybe from different sectors where it's not just a pure tech focus.
Yeah.
Very early days, people were coming up with ideas for how you re-architect financial markets when they hadn't ever worked within financial markets. And people were saying, well, we're not going to need banks and we won't be regulated, so go away, regulators. And it's like, well, not really, because laws are laws and you can choose to break them, but no amount of technology is going to stop the police coming and knocking on your door and drag you to prison if that's the law in your country. So, get real here. The opportunity is actually, yes, things are potentially can and should and need to be improved the way that markets, money, and financial system exists now. But it's going to be, it's going to be a case of making progress, improving on what we have, but it's not going to go completely to the other extreme, because the reality is that's not what most people want. In the early days, if you were a pure kind of anarcho-capitalist or libertarian views where you don't need state at all or you don't need rules or government, that's fine. You're entitled to that ideology. I don't think technology is going to change people's ideology. Reality is, whether you like it or not, there's a middle ground where people just want to get on with their lives. And hopefully, as we've seen through the growth of the internet, this technology will eventually become embedded. It will improve people's lives. It will improve things around, it's become a big meme around identity and data leakage with these centralized organizations. Hopefully this technology is going to improve that and we'll end up with a better system. But I think people need to be realistic.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. What do you think about, obviously from the early days until now, the technology has developed a lot. And as you mentioned, there are loads of projects that emerge and actually build something useful and are already changing different industries in the space. Are there any projects that you are in particularly impressed with and really like what they bring into the space at the moment?
It's definitely hard to keep up on all of them, as you know.
Yeah.
I'm sure you see lots of pitch decks. So, I think the good thing about some of the communities that have moved on to, whether it's Telegram, I think WhatsApp's probably my preferred one because they don't grow too big. Everyone was getting on Telegram chats and it was good for the first 2 weeks when there was 40 people and then there was 4,000 and it all got very noisy. I've noticed that as long as you're plugged into some of these groups and you trust the people that are in the groups, anything because it is impossible to go and try and filter out everything, that what is obviously good will kind of come to your attention because you'll see more and more people talking about it. But in general, and if we go back again to the beginning and how we've moved on from those early days, I guess companies like Coinbase are a good example, and BitPay when they started out. We had a very raw protocol, which was Bitcoin, and whatever people thought it might be able to do. The reality is it was very raw. The scaling was always going to be a problem and have to be addressed at some point. So those early companies that came along were like giving you an application layer, trying to make it easier for the user, and down here we had a foundation layer and there was nothing really in the middle. Mm-hmm. So I think what we've seen over the last few years is, I guess, from a more technical point of view or from what developers would be looking at, is getting more kind of middleware in between. So we're having kind of layers built on top of the base layer, which is making it easy for people to develop or not to develop on. And obviously Ethereum was an obvious kind of version of that, but people are looking at doing the same with Bitcoin, making it more accessible from the developer point of view. And then up top, user experience has always been a big thing. And it's great to be your own bank or have the possibility of being your own bank. But again, we're all human, especially when we start talking larger numbers of value or amounts of value. Simple things like key management have still not been fully addressed at all. And they're still not ready for, mom and pops and grandma and grandpa. But we're getting there. So we're seeing some good projects there. I was speaking to the guys at Argent the other day, who are doing, addressing that kind of usability and addressing the issue around security and the ability to safely back up your private keys, etc. The guys here in London, Hexa Wallet, similar objectives. Got the Casa guys that are looking at. So all these things are coming through, which I think are important. But we're still, I always say, this is all about building blocks. And I still think we're in the building block phase. people want to go and establish their businesses. I'm not dismissing the ideas, because some ideas that have come out and people have are way beyond, my pay grade. But people want them to happen now. I think the reality is,
it takes time. Yeah.
It takes time to build the infrastructure. We saw this in the early days of the internet. I always use the example that, SMTP was developed in the earliest days of the internet before, when the networks were still pretty, they weren't nearly as kind of open as they are now because TCP/IP hadn't been invented. But, email was invented in the early 70s. It took TCP/IP to be developed in the 80s to allow kind of open communication between these networks. We then needed, and people were using email, but it wasn't ubiquitous. But then we had, HTTP, and the web came along in the late 80s. So the idea that we could actually have usability on the internet with a kind of graphic interfaces and like simpler interaction. And then we had the first browsers come along after that, which had been inspired by obviously HTTP and the web and the work of Tim Berners-Lee. And then once we had that and people were building websites, someone else came along and said, hey, how about we take that email thing that was invented 20 years ago or more and stick it in a web browser and make it really simple to use. And then you have Hotmail, and then email goes viral. So, it's a good example of how the building blocks are there, the ideas are there, but the pieces aren't.
So when do you think
missing pieces of the puzzle? And I think we're going through that phase. That was 20 years, and because of the additional complexities around this, because of the additional security risks around this, one thing I always said, I remember early days of our meetups, people would come in and say, Bitcoin's going to replace Visa next year. And I'm like, A, they're two different things, and B, it's not going to happen that quick. This is a 20 to 50 year project. So I think we're halfway through.
Okay, so when do you think we're gonna, so like the Hotmail alternative of the blockchain, we're gonna get in about 15 years, more or less?
Well, I'd say we're a good 10 years in now. So what it will take is, at some point there'll be some young chap or chapess, one young lad or lady out there, probably not even in their teens yet, and they'll be scratching away on their computer in their bedroom in a few years' time, and they'll have all these building blocks, and they'll say, how about I take one of those, and two of those, knit them together, and then something smart comes up. Bitcoin was the same. I mean, Bitcoin was 20 years in evolution. I mean, if you trace back to David Chown in the early 80s and in the work that was done since then by Adam Back and Wai-Dai and Nick Szabo, a lot of what Bitcoin became was taking these pieces that had been developed beforehand, and he knitted them together in a very smart way and solved an additional problem, and that was Bitcoin. So again, another example of 20 years in evolution just before we got to Bitcoin.
Yeah, I see that. So what do you think? What's the importance of the community in this space? What is the role that it plays, and how we can make it kind of, dive into the right direction and bring even more positive impact somehow?
So, well, there's a few things. Obviously, we just mentioned that looking at new companies, new opportunities coming through. It's difficult. There's a lot of stuff out there now. I think some feedback I've had over the last couple of years is we do a good job of filtering. It doesn't stop we at least we'll do some of the work for the audience and make sure that whatever it is or whoever we're putting or inviting to come on stage, that we at least consider they're legitimate and is potentially an interesting idea or subject. With the community side, unfortunately, I got a bit trolled on Twitter the other day because being told that we started out as a Bitcoin meetup, but we shill shitcoins now, because we had people like Cardano or Tezos, teams from Tezos in last year, which look, who knows what's going to happen with these, but they're definitely smart teams, and they're definitely worth listening to. I think the problem with this whole the tribalism is that people need to understand that it's impossible to decide who's won already, and everyone should be learning from everyone else. There's smart people working on all these different projects. So the community part really is, I think, stopping, hopefully, in that, what we do, hopefully trying to kind of overcome some of that tribalism. But it is still there for people to be educated and come together and share ideas, because there's still so much more work to do to make this really ready for the mainstream and for mass adoption. And there's always smart people that come in, and it doesn't have to be. The biggest thing I've learned is I've met some super smart developers over the time, and I said, always nervous of getting involved, but they can be super smart, but they can also very easily miss certain things which they just don't know about, of how other areas of business work, and we're seeing, we're seeing people from traditional finance come in now and work with the really smart developers, and they're learning from each other, and I think that's healthy. So but in general, education's been a key, and meeting people's been a key, and I think that's always been the most important thing, and I think that's what people still get out of it most.
Yeah, I agree. And since we're getting closer to the end, we didn't cover the crazy bits. So, I'm sure you were part of this big community from the very beginning. You had contacts with so many people who were in their beginning of their success journeys in the space, etc. What is the craziest thing that happened to you over the time?
Let's put me on the spot a little bit. The crazy bits. I don't know. I did particularly enjoy. I still very much enjoy it. But those early days when it was the excitement around it, from when these people did start kind of gathering and meeting, and seeing people make the mistakes and first attempts. I guess what was one of the first attempts at what became known as ICOs was a project called Neo-B way back. A chap called Danny Brewster raised some money, had big ambitions to launch a Bitcoin bank in Cyprus. It didn't work out. It didn't work out. The investors didn't work out for him. He got a lot of slack for it. I met him recently, and he's a super good guy. Really is very, whatever might have been written about him, he's got very good intent, and it's unfortunate that episode happened, but we've seen that happen like 1,000 times since. So seeing that happen, and these initial ideas and these money being raised, and things from going from nothing to be valued at nothing, sitting with the guys, some of the guys involved with Ethereum in the earliest days, where they've got an idea on paper, and then 2 or 3 years later it's a multi-billion-dollar network, is all pretty crazy. I remember there was an early conference in London, down in Brick Lane, less of a conference, more of a festival, I guess. Had people like Cody Wilson there, the guy that designed and invented the 3D printable gun, up on stage giving a rousing speech and presentation. People like Amir, who I mentioned, and people like Peter Todd, these guys in the early days that really, spoke their mind, but you could back it up, because these were super smart people. I mean, if people don't know Amir, I'd recommend you go and read an article about him on, I think it's in Wired magazine. Again, he put his money where his mouth is, and went to go and read the story. Look up Amir Taki in Wired magazine. He decided he should go and back up his principles, not just talk, but look to go and help people less fortunate overseas through coding. And it turned into a bit of an adventure for him. So I recommend that read. I remember the guys Mihai brought in a stack of Bitcoin magazine, first edition, famous one with the Occupy mask on the front cover. And I think he left about 50 of them in the pub. And I took one, some people took one, and we left a good 50 of them there. I remember checking online during the 2017 bubble, when they were going for like $800 a piece on eBay. So I think we left about 30 or 40,000 bucks sitting on the table in the pub, which is it's a bit of a mistake, I guess.
Nice. Yeah. Okay, so hopefully I'll meet you on your next meetup in person, because we've never met in person before. But thank you very much for the interview. It was really nice to meet you, and hopefully we'll stay in touch. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Very much enjoyed it, Annie. And see you at the next event, 6th of February in London. And we're talking about the state of blockchain mining with Pavel, the CEO at Slushpool. So he developed the first ever Bitcoin mining pool. And then we've got very interesting Bitcoin Lightning project as well. So see you all there.
Nice. Interesting. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Annie. Bye-bye.
Bye.